Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains. You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a helicopter, right round, round, round. And today, we are going to discuss helicopters again, and I am over the moon regarding the success of my first ever part, 5 of the worst helicopters ever. Naturally, this means that I have to make a sequel, as I do with every successful bad list, because there's plenty of bad things to talk about. This world is full of failure, is what I'm trying to say. And let's begin with 5 more of the worst helicopters ever. The Eurocopter Tiger ARH. Now, I do want to specify the ARH variant, which stands for Armed Reconnaissance Helicopter, when I discuss the Tiger, because in certain contexts and uses, the Tiger is an alright military platform. It was manufactured by Eurocopter initially, although now they're known as Airbus helicopters, and if you're French, you might call it the Tigre, which is just French and Spanish for tiger. Germany, however, refers to it as the Tiger, and that's also what we would call this animal in English, so I'm gonna go with Tiger. Either way, the development of this helicopter actually took an absurd amount of time, as it started coming together during the Cold War, and it was meant to be an anti-tank platform to be used against a possible Soviet ground invasion of Western Europe. It took so long to develop the stupid thing that the Soviet Union collapsed, but France and Germany in particular chose to persist with development anyway. They'd already sunk plenty of costs into it regardless, and transitioned it into the idea of a multi-role attack helicopter. It first flew on the 27th of April 1991, but they weren't actually introduced to any of the militaries that used them, French, German, Australian, and Spanish, until 2003. And even then, they weren't actually considered to have achieved operational readiness until 2008. The length of time it took to get these things in the air could be a video all on its own, because there's a lot of design mismanagement and politics going into this. It's just kind of a mess. But again, they have been deployed in a few areas, such as Afghanistan, by the militaries that use them. And sometimes they're actually fine. When they're maintained well and experienced crews operate them, they are an okay combat platform. But the version the Australians chose to purchase resulted in a lot of issues. Now, at the time, Australia really desperately needed a new helicopter combat platform. They were still using Bell OH-58s and UH-1s. Yes, they were still using Hueys in the early 2000s. They needed something a lot more modern, and that's totally fine. The Tiger ARH was a modified and upgraded version of the helicopter, and it used MTR 390 engines, as well as a new laser designator that was incorporated into the Strix sight for the firing of Hellfire II air-to-ground missiles. 22 of them were ordered by Australia in December of 2001, and most of the helicopters were meant to be operated by the 1st Aviation Regiment that was based at Robertson Barracks in Darwin. They received the first 2 helicopters on the 15th of December 2004, and the deliveries were meant to be completed by June 2010. Which again, that's 6 years. How long does it take you to put a helicopter together? Sorry. And even then, they weren't going to achieve full operating capability until December of 2011. That date, by the way, got pushed back. They suffered multiple problems. In 2012, there were at least 3 incidents of cockpit fumes that endangered the crews. The pilots actually refused to fly the stupid things until the safety concerns were addressed, which I totally don't blame them for that. That wasn't their only issues, as by 2016, multiple things were cited. There was a lack of commonality with the ARHs when compared to other variants of the Tigers. The engines that they in particular used had really high maintenance costs, and the shipping time of sending parts from Europe was also a great hindrance. The Australian Defence White Paper stated that the Tiger helicopters would be replaced with other armed reconnaissance aircraft sometime in the mid-2020s, which is an embarrassing short amount of time for a platform that was so expensive, and on paper should have been absolutely okay. The helicopters also, by the way, didn't actually reach their full operating capability until the 18th of April, 2016. The Australians went through with replacing them, by the way. In July of 2019, Australia's Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, or CASG, issued a request for information to replace their Tiger helicopters. A lot of observers were actually confused by the decision by this point because in the Tiger's defense, by that time, they had managed to fix a lot of the problems. But the CASG was really gung-ho about getting a hold of a proven and mature, manned, off-the-shelf armed helicopter. So you want Apaches. That's what you're saying with that. That is actually, I literally can't think of a better option in that case. Why didn't you just pay us in the first place? Look, I know no one likes to admit that they buy weapons off of us, but you do. It's okay. And sure enough, in January 2021, the Australian government announced that they were going to purchase an as of yet unspecified number of AH-64E Apache Guardian helicopters, specifically to replace the Tigers. Why didn't you just buy our Apaches in the first place? Look, I'm sorry. We make good military equipment here generally. It's kind of our thing. You don't have to be ashamed of your decision. The Apaches are great. You're making a good call. And I'm sorry, Tigers. You tried. It just didn't go so well. At least not in Australia. Though I will stress that other variants of the Tigers, like the HAPs and the HADs, are actually still in service with Germany, France, and Spain. And according to them, they're actually operating according to procedure, so perhaps in those guises, they're okay. But if you ask Australia, no, not so much. The Westland 30. This is a medium-sized civilian helicopter that was designed and produced by British aerospace company Westland Helicopters. It's actually derived from the Westland Lynx series of military helicopters, and it's actually very similar to them. 41 were built between 1981 and 1987, but they were retired pretty quick, like 1991. And there's a few reasons for that. Though, in its defense, similarly to the Tiger, there's actually a lot of political issues going into the reason why these helicopters failed so bluntly. Since this was a civil model, there were actually no military customers that wanted it, though several civilian operators like British Airways Helicopters, Airspur Helicopters Incorporated, and Omniflight Helicopter Services were interested in the design. But the most prominent operator of these things was in India, Pawan Hans. The company acquired 21 of these things specifically for oil exploration purposes, but this is where the type ran into a lot of trouble. When it was operated by British companies and in British weather, it actually performed quite well. There was apparently a major reluctance from the British Civilian Aviation Authority and the British Airports Authority to permit a helicopter service that linked Milton Keynes with London City Airport. This kind of made the helicopters pointless since the whole point of them was to be a civilian transport helicopter. If the government wasn't going to allow that, then the companies really didn't have much use for them. Airspur Helicopters, over here in America, actually used 4 of them on lease for scheduled passenger flights in the LA area. Omniflight also did something similar on behalf of Pan American World Airways. They linked JFK International Airport with Pan Am's heliport at East 60th Street in central Manhattan. But this particular kind of service was proven to be completely unprofitable. Helicopters are very expensive to run, and it's hard to convince people to pay for a ticket that would cover the cost of operation. There's a reason why you don't see this type of private helicopter service that often, unless someone actually owns their own helicopter and can afford it. But the big one we want to talk about is the Indian company Pawan Hans. During March of 1986, the British government agreed to supply India with 21 of the Westland 30s specifically for oil exploration duties. This was also under a British grant of £65 million. But India was actually reluctant to accept the deal until the UK basically told them it's this or nothing. So they took the helicopters. They received the helicopters between 1986 and 1988, but quickly the Westland 30s were proving to be a major problem. They just weren't cut out for hot climates. They couldn't handle it at all. In order to keep them going, their GEM engines needed high servicing, and the issues resulted in at least 2 fatal accidents. After this, they were grounded and placed into storage in 1991. 19 of those would actually be sold in October of 2000 to a British company, AES Aerospace, but they only got 6 when the deal fell through. As a result, it's believed that the remaining Westland 30s that aren't in some kind of museum are still sitting in storage somewhere in India. It's kind of unfortunate for me to put them on the list because in other applications they really weren't atrocious, but when you put them in a hot climate, they got people killed. Kinda can't ignore that, not gonna lie. The Sikorsky CH-37 Mojave. Now that helicopter looks a little big chungus, not gonna lie. This thing first flew on the 18th of December 1953, and they were introduced in July of 1956. They only lasted until the late 60s though, and they only ever built 154 of them, and you may be wondering why. Was it because they're kinda chunky, impossibly ugly looking? Well, no. Aesthetics are debatable here, but its perceived weird appearance actually had very little to do with its problems. At the time of its introduction, it was the largest helicopter in the Western world, and it was Sikorsky's first twin-engine helicopter. It used 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-WAS radial engines that were mounted in those outboard pods. It also had some rather interesting innovations for a helicopter at the time. Retractable landing gear, clamshell doors in the front that could be used for easy loading and unloading. Sounds pretty good actually, but there's a problem with the whole loading thing here. In that, this helicopter could not carry that much beyond itself. See, the CH-37 is one of the last helicopters to use piston engines, and there's a reason for that. Piston engines are naturally larger, heavier, and less powerful than the turboshaft engines that would be used in later military helicopters. Now, the R2800s were very powerful engines. Each one individually put out 2100 horsepower. That's good, but they also each weighed 2,360 pounds. This meant that their power-to-weight ratio was only 0.89. It really wasn't that much. As a result, the empty weight of this helicopter was about 20,800 pounds. Its maximum takeoff weight was 31,000 pounds. That's just over 10,000 pounds of useful load that you could put onto it, and that's not taking into account the weight of the fuel on board. So its ability to lift things was very, very, very compromised, and given the fact that it was supposed to be a transport helicopter, this is a pretty crippling flaw. The Mojaves quickly found themselves not being very helpful, and they were replaced pretty much as soon as they could be just because they weren't really good for very much. They were expensive to operate given their size, and they weren't able to carry that much, so it's like, why are you so big? Why even make them that big? Most of what they lift is themselves! I mean, come on now! They were able to be used in Vietnam to actually assist in the recovery of downed US aircraft, and they were actually pretty good at that, honestly. Many of the aircraft they were sent to get were within their lift ratios, so they were able to do that just fine. Some of the downed aircraft were recovered from behind enemy lines, and it amounted to a recovery operation that brought back about $7.5 million worth of equipment. They also used these things to recover film capsules that were descending from space by parachute as a part of a whole heap of NASA missions. So it wasn't like the Mojave couldn't be used for certain things because they were reliable. It wasn't like they were dangerous or anything. It's just when it came to being useful, they weren't good for very much. The Agusta A.106. What in the world is that thing? I mean, that's a helicopter. I see that. You don't have to tell me about it. Well, you're looking at a single-seat light helicopter that was designed to provide an anti-submarine warfare platform for the Impavido-class destroyers of the Italian Navy. So, they're small. What's the big deal? I mean, if they're small but they work, there shouldn't be a problem. Well, this is another issue when it came to takeoff weight, which plagued the Mojave, but to a much greater extent this one. Its fully loaded takeoff weight was about 1,400 kilograms, which means it may have weighed less than your car. The thing would be equipped with 2 Mark 44 torpedoes, but they were slung under the fuselage. With only a single-man crew, it meant that they were only good to go where they were told to go when they took off, and then dropping their payloads, and then coming back. This really isn't an ideal military situation, what I'm trying to say. Usually helicopters at least have 2-man crews. Photos of the cockpit also showed that these things didn't have that many avionics, leaving us to wonder how the lone pilot was supposed to navigate in any way. It was supposed to have an acoustic submarine detection system but it's not clear by the pictures where that even would have gone, or how much it would have weighed. You know, looking at it and looking how it was supposed to operate, it's kind of like if you took an R-22 and slung 2 torpedoes underneath it. It's got that same energy here. The point is, there's a reason why the Navy wound up canceling the whole project. They only ever made 2 of them, and both of those were considered prototypes. They first flew in 1965, and they were retired by 1973. The Hughes XH-17, the Flying Crane. This, that exists. Wow. What an interesting helicopter. Yes, we're going to call it that, though I think we're stretching the definition a little bit here. This thing first flew on the 23rd of October 1952, and it actually wasn't designed by the Hughes Aircraft Company. Just so we're clear, I do mean that Hughes Aircraft Company, the one under Howard Robert Hughes Jr., who was legendary as an incredibly successful businessman who touched all sorts of projects, especially aircraft. He also may have been quite a bit crazy, but we won't get into that right now. Anyway, this thing was actually designed by another company called Kellett, but Kellett didn't want it. They were going through financial trouble at the time, so they sold the design to Hughes. In the 1940s, Hughes had actually developed an interest in helicopters, and in August of 1947 is when they bought this design. Hughes himself commissioned the development of the XH-17 Flying Crane research vehicle, and in 1948, the whole thing began to take shape. Now, looking at the design of it, you may think that this looks like a bunch of pieces of other aircraft duct taped together. And frankly, that's not too far from the truth. The front wheels came from a North American B-25 Mitchell, and the rear wheels came from a Douglas C-54 Skymaster. Its fuel tank was originally a bomb bay mounted unit from a Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The cockpit is from a Waco CG-15 military glider, and its tail rotor is off of a Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw. The point is, almost every single piece of this thing wasn't actually designed for it, except perhaps the main rotors. See, this thing actually utilized tip jet technology, which I've discussed before, and the technology can work in some aspects. In this instance, 2 General Electric J35 turbojet engines sent bleed air up through the rotor hub. This thing's blades were hollow, and the hot compressed air traveled through the blades to the tip jets where fuel was injected. In flight, the main rotor spun at a sedate 88 revolutions per minute, which is actually less than half the speed of typical helicopter rotors. Little torque compensation was required, and that's why when compared to its giant main rotor, the tail rotor looks positively dinky. This really was, though, only meant to be a test bed of sorts. Though Hughes was kind of pushing for it to be something greater than that, it never really amounted to much. For one thing, when it was supposed to be under ground testing, it had a habit of really desperately wanting to get off the ground. It really actually wanted to fly, but not in a stable way. Its giant rotors meant that it had a lot of lift potential, and that's good, but there were actually several unintended test flights prior to the official one that took place on the 16th of September 1952. The reason for that is that its tether kept breaking. Test pilot Gail Moore took it officially into the sky, and found that the control balance for this thing was actually ideal for a rotor test rig, but not actually very good for a legitimate in-air helicopter. The whole thing definitely flew, but it was almost impossible to control in any real way. Moore actually struggled to put it back on the ground because it so desperately wished to leap into the sky and remain there. Believe it or not, they did tinker with it and managed to limit this issue and give it some level of control, and then it entered into an intensive 10-hour test program, but after that, the rotor fatigue life was used up. There wasn't any money to invest in the concept further. It was considered a developmental dead end. They did attempt to propose a 4-bladed production version that was going to be called the XH-28, but the Army wasn't interested. Such an aircraft possibly could have been used to move tanks across the battlefield, which would have been nice, but this thing was loud. Tip jets are loud! In the defense of Howard Hughes and his company, they actually went on to produce some decent helicopters after this, but this, in particular, just didn't turn out so great. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hawk 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, and Anzac A1. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.